In summary, what we did is we took a look at meat consumption patterns around the world, looking at most of the primary countries around the world, population centers around the world. What are their per capita consumption patterns? What trends do we see? We found the strongest correlation to be with income and GDP growth, or gross domestic product, in each country divided by number of people. And we saw some interesting patterns within that. We then projected from that what meat consumption patterns are overall, and therefore what meat production patterns need to be and are expected to be, assuming that demand will drive production. And then from that, we correlated to feed consumption, specifically to the protein meals, found very strong correlations with soy meal and with rapeseed meal, much weaker correlations with the other meals, and then made projections on what needs to happen in the way of production increases for those meals over the next couple of years, and where that's likely to take place. Most interesting find overall from our studies was the strong demand of meal from pork and poultry, and how we're seeing a strong global movement toward poultry, but also pork production, but especially poultry, which is the biggest consumer of protein meal. So protein meal demand overall is rising at a very rapid rate, while supplies are relatively tight. The key takeaway overall from our work was that protein meal is rising in demand dramatically, driven by the increased consumption patterns of poultry globally and pork in many significant populated countries. And so, but the supply is overall tight, so we're going to have to see increased production. We're seeing a concentration of the meat production, and we're going to have to be able to move that meal from the countries where production increases to where it's being consumed. For soy meal, the next couple years, that increase in production probably needs to come from the United States overall, but beyond that, probably more so from South America. Rapeseed meal, probably expansion in Canada, Europe, and in China. Yeah, the market right now is telling us we need to plant more proteins near term and not the starches. And corn, through its ethanol, dried distillers, grains, solubles, does produce a protein, but overall the market's saying we need you to plant proteins. We need you to plant soybeans for the coming growing season, and we're not seeing that incentive yet to the farmer. A professor told me 40 years ago that the American farmer loves to plant corn and only doesn't plant corn if he can't because of soil or climate. And so we have to have that extra price incentive to make the switch necessary to move towards soybeans this next year. The recent survey of producers conducted by farmfutures.com showed a shift of roughly 1 million acres from corn to soybeans. And we need to see that more in the line of 3 to 4 million acres for this coming year in order to meet the demand for protein we see globally, with expansion relatively flat in Brazil and Argentina making a shift near term toward better crop rotations, moving away from soybeans toward more corn and wheat. Definitely seeing some changes in demographics that I think will impact consumption patterns, particularly for what meats are consumed and therefore for the meal to produce that. One of those is very much of an aging population, especially in Europe and in parts of East Asia, Southeast Asia, definitely seeing an aging of population, whereas by 2050 we see nearly 2/3 of the population being over 65 years of age in Asia, for example. Aging population tends to have more limited income and make fewer changes in meat consumption, but overall income is the big driver. And so we see continued move toward more poultry consumption, which tends to be more affordable, but also a bigger consumer in production-wise of the protein meals. So that just speaks for more demand for protein meal for producing the poultry down the road.